Today's daf is daf Tzadi Beis, and we'll begin with Niseis Alpi Bezdin, which you'll see towards the top of the Amud, the last word in line 3. And this is a quote from the Mishnah. So let's just mention the following. As we begin, we know that Bezdin, when they make a tos in their horah, and their matir is something that's really asur, and if that isur is an isur chamur, which when violated, b'mezid would generate kares, and b'shogeg chatos, if as a result of the horah's Bezdin, the tzibur implemented that horah, then Bezdin is chayiv to bring what's called a par helim davar shel tzibur as a karban chatos on behalf of the entire tzibur. In other words, no single individual has to bring the karban. The karban is either a kivtza or a seira as a chatos, and it's incumbent upon the tzibur, and that's going to be represented by Bezdin. What we're going to study now is the discussion about which horos are exceptions to this rule. So the rule again is that Bezdin made a mistake with their horah. The tzibur as a tzibur is chai, but not the tzibur as a yachid. No individual is chai. The Mishnah says, Niseis al pi Bezdin, teitze. Now, whenever we see that phrase al pi Bezdin in our context, it means al pi eid echad, that Bezdin had to accept the testimony of one witness. And the Mishnah says that now after she got married, based on the heter Bezdin, the horas Bezdin, and of course her husband comes back alive, teitze, but it says petura minat karban, even though she violated HSE, she would normally be chayv a karban. Here she's not chayv a karban. Amar Zeiri. Now we're going to study machlokas between Zeiri and Rav Nachman. Less alamasnisim. We don't paskin like this Mishnah. And even though the Mishnah has established that she is exempt from a karban, we reject this Mishnah because of a brisa. Now, of course, we could always ask, why reject the Mishnah because of a brisa? But in any event, Tani Bei Midrasha, this is what we learned in a brisa. Oru Bezdin Sheshaka Chama. This is on a Shabbos. And Bezdin issued a ruling that it's after sunset and we're allowed to do malach. Ulabasof, Zarcha. The sun came out behind the clouds, and we realized that this was a horah b'tos, and it was Shabbos, and they allowed the people to do malach. Now, you and I would have said, without too much iyun, just on a superficial level, that in this case, Bezdin has to bring a parallel davar shel tzibur. And the Brisa says no. Ein zo horah elatos. There are two different categories here. One is called a horah, and again, it was a mistaken horah, but it's not called a tos. In Zeiri's language, there's another kind of so-called horah, which is not a horah at all. It's a tos. When Bezdin says that Shabbos is ended because the sun is set, and in fact, the sun didn't set, that's not a horah. That's a tos. There's no way you could say, well, Bezdin was weighing back and forth the logical possibilities and the biblical dictates and the principles, and they made a misguided decision. That's not what's going on over here. They made a decision that is not reflected in reality. The reality stares them in the face and says, no, the sun is still shining. And that's called tos. And in the case of tos, it becomes clear to everyone that it was simply a mistake. They really made a mistake. It wasn't a matter of judgment call. It's a matter of describing a reality that is antithetical to the true reality. In such a case, Bezdin did not bring a par helam davar shel tzibur, but each yachid, every individual now who violated the Shabbos, has to bring his own karban chatos. Meaning, in a case where Bezdin made a mistaken horah, but there was a horah, a real bona fide judicial horah, the verdict was a verdict, the ruling was a ruling, then the individual is swallowed up by the par helam davar shel tzibur. But if there's no horah, but rather it's toes, then every individual member of Klal Yisrael who violated the Shabbos has to bring his own karban chatos. And now Zeiri says that by analogy, in our Mishnah, when she got married based on the Horas Bezdin, so to speak, the Psak of Bezdin, let's call it, we shouldn't call it Horas Bezdin, because the Zeiri is going to say that this is a toes. This is not a horah. What do you mean? Bezdin says, go get married because your husband's dead. Ha! What a joke. Her husband's alive. The sun is hiding behind the clouds. Look at it now. It appeared in full zenith. You can see it. It's on the horizon. It's still Shabbos. So according to the logic of Zeira, this is not a case where she got married based on a horas Bezdin. Simply Bezdin was mistaken about the reality. There's a birur that the reality is not what Bezdin thought it was. This is called a tos. This is not called a horah. And therefore, we're going to reject our Mishnah, says the Iri, in favor of this brisa, and she will bring a karban chatos. And for that matter, he also, the Boel, second husband, will bring a karban chatos. So basically, according to Zeiri, because we're going to see right now Rabbi Nachman, who's going to reject Zeiri, Zeiri's position is that Bezdin trusted the aide. They thought he was telling the truth, and now it's crystal clear that they were mistaken, that the reality is not what they thought it was. And according to Zeiri, there's no difference between A and B. A is where they thought the reality was because the sun was hidden behind the clouds, and B, they were mistaken about the reality because they naively relied on the testimony of one single witness. Rav Nachman Omar, Horahi. No. If they didn't see the sun, that's a tos. But here, this is a horah. Horah means that Bezdin made a shikol hadas. They weighed in on various halachic principles, and when they fed all these principles into their mind, they made a judgment call. That's the key word, a judgment call. We call it in Hebrew, shikol hadas. What was that shikol hadas? Well, the Torah says you need two eidim. But there's another principle of the Torah, which is called Isha Daiku Mitzvah. So when they gave her a heter, what they were doing was they were weighing Har Cheskas Eishesish against A plus B, A, the testimony of one aide, and B, her inquiries, which they assumed that she did a good job. She hired a private detective before she got married to someone else. And that's called Daiku Mitzvah. Says Rav Nachman, that's called a horas Bezdin. This is not that Bezdin just saw a reality. They saw a dead body and they thought it was his. No. That would be a toast. They didn't make a toast because they didn't identify the reality as they should have. No. They made a horah. And the horah was based on shikul das, halachic considerations, and various judgment calls, and that's called a horah. Hence, the Mishnah is correct. She will not bring a karban. This is not called a hora b'mitzius. It's not called a tos. This is called a hora. Now, of course, you could say, well, what about a parahel individual tzibur according to Rav Nachman? Well, the answer is, we're not talking about a tzibur here. We're talking about one woman who violated Eishes Ish, but we're not talking about a tzibur. If you could imagine that based on this shikol hadas, the tzibur itself as a community would have violated Eishes Ish or something like that, and Echinami, the president would be chayiv in a parahel individual tzibur because this is a hora. And Omer Rav Nachman Teda, I'm going to prove it to you. Torahi, the B'chol Torah Kulei Echad Lo Hemen. When you want to clarify something and you need evidence, one witness is not reliable. So there must have been a judiciary decision here to upgrade the status of one aid to two aidim. That's not a mistake in reality, in Mitzias. That's a mistake in Shikol Hadas. Hacha Mehemen, and why did they? What halachic reasoning or logic were they utilizing here? Lab Mishum Doroi, they made a hora that Beis Din could upgrade the status of an Eid Echad to that of two Eidim. That's halachic consideration, and it's all based on the fact that Isha Daiku Minsaba, that the halacha operates with the premise that a woman doesn't get married unless she checks out what the aid said. And she'll hire, as we said before, Sherlock Holmes to make sure that her husband is dead before she gets married. Okay, her husband showed up on 2 feet, so we know that the hora was a mistaken hora, but that's what hora b'tos is. Hora b'tos means that they made a mistake in Shikol Hadas. This is a mistake in Shikol Hadas. They weighed the evidence, and based on their halachic thinking caps in terms of weighing the evidence, they decided that she's allowed to get married. They gave her a hora that she's allowed to get married. And that hora remains a hora. He writes Nimtza in the Masechet Sheni Su'eh when the Baal comes back. Sheni Su'eh Ashniyim, her marriage to the second guy. Hayu Machmas Hora Hamutes Shel Beis Din. So it's interesting. If they would have just said, well, the reality has to be that your husband died because this Joe, this Eid Echad is saying so, that would be a tos. If they did a reality check based on the testimony of one aide, and that was it, you have, what's it called in law? Expert witness. You remember that phrase, an expert witness? What's an expert witness? Sometimes the courts don't know the reality. They need someone who's an expert in that field, and he will give them the reality. And if that reality is not true, that's called a tos. Because their Beis Din is not functioning as a Beis Din. They're just almost an investigatory board to check out the reality and bring in expert witnesses. This Eid Echad is not an expert witness. This is an issue of whether the Torah and halacha recognizes the Eid Echad to be mater and Eishes Ish. And Beis Din, using their powers invested in them as a Beis Din, they decided that yes, the halacha is we will rely on Eid Echad together with Daiku Mitzvah. These are halachic deliberations and considerations. That's called a hora b'tos. And I'll be honest with you, Rabbi, this sugya is not for a daf yomi shir. This is very profound. I mean, we're just trying within the framework of the time that and the energy that we have. This is the best we can do. Amar Rava Teidalecha. Rava goes back to Zeiri, and he believes that this is called a tos. That Beis Din were totally relying on Eid Echad, and that was a tos. The tos, who it's not a hora. The ilu horu Beis Din bechelef ubedam lehetera v'hadar chazu. Taima le'isura is ki hadre the amre lehetera lo mishkachidele. Okay, we'll try to understand Rava's understanding here. A man ate something because of Horas Bezdin. Bezdin told him that this is not the chalev that the Torah prohibited. This is not the dam. There are 5 different types of dam, and chalev looks like shuman. This is not prohibited. And it's mutar b'achila. And then Bezdin saw some sort of a logic that forced them to rescind their original hora and to paskin that it's also. Ki hadre, when they change their mind and they want to rescind their original ruling, the amri letera, and now they want to go back to their original position that it's mutter. Lo mashkachinenu. We're not going to pay any attention to them. And in contrast, the iluhacha b'eidecha dioseidecha, one aide came and testified that her husband died. Sharena, they were matir her to get married, and then asu trey. Now they have 2 witnesses who come by and say her husband is still alive. Asarna, we prohibit her. Ihadar asa eidachrina. Let's say now a second aide would come and testify to support the testimony of the first aide. So you have a sandwich here. You have 1 aide le'atera, 2 aidim li'sura, 1 aide le'atera, sharinala, and will be matir her. So why is it that in the case of a tos and chelef, they were matir, and then they came back and they decided it's asur? If now Bezdin would come back with some sort of compelling logic that's not totally convincing, and they want to be matir again, we're not going to pay any attention to it. And yet in the case of Eid Echad, if the second aid comes at the end of this whole story, we will be matir her to get married. We'll rely on the second aid together with the first aid, my timer. What's the difference between these 2 cases? Why is it that they could rescind their Isser and go back to Heter in the case of Eid Echad? Lav mishum de tosu. If the original hora was a hora, then once they reject that hora, they can no longer go back and accept that hora. That's like, just to give you an example, I don't know if it's a perfect analogy. In Eidus, there's something called Kevin Jehigid Chuvei Nechozer Mag. You cannot rescind your Eidus. Again, others can contradict you, but you yourself cannot rescind your Eidus. So you gave hora, and that hora turns out to be a weak hora. And now, based on new evidence that came in, you want to reject that hora. That's fine. But you could never go back and reiterate that original hora. So now, when they go back after all the deliberations and they come back to the original full swing to the original hora, we're not going to accept it. But in the case of Eid Echad, that's a whole different story. When they relied on one witness and they allowed to get married, it turns out after the 2 Eidim come in, that's a tos. Is it a tos? Well, now we have another aid. And if we could pull in another aid to testify that her husband died, then we're not sure it's a tos. And now Bezdin could come back to the original psak that they gave, because in its time, meaning in between time T1 and T3, it was a tos. And this is against Rav Nachman. Why? Because if we would accept Rav Nachman, then Rav Nachman understands that when the Bezdin rejects their original position, which was Lakula based on an Eid Echad, that's not a tos, that's a horah. And if that was a horah, then if Bezdin rescinds that horah, they no longer have rights to re-examine the case, to open the case again, and go back to the original horah. He says, "Ilu mashitiru osa b'rishon al pi eid echad," as Rav Nachman would have it. Hoya machmas horah is Bezdin, and it's a real bona fide horah. Then when they reject that horah, they have no rights to go back and reiterate and reenact and reestablish that horah. Shuv lo hayu cholim lachzar ulatira, when the last aid came in. Because once the aidim in the middle came to Aserit, al pi edusam barash bezdin lo pasku ka'alacha meaning in the right way, mitchila. Vishuv, Einam Yecholim Lachzo Lo Ra Rishona. But if the Ra Rishona was a toast, then it makes sense. Now they can go back to square one, reopen the case, and they can put 1 and 1 together. 1 + 1 = 2. The Af Rabbi Eliezer Savar, he also holds like Zeiri, and the heter of a woman in Bezdin based on Eid Echad is a tosu, and it's not a ra. The Sanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer, if a woman got married based on the testimony of one witness and Bezdin accepted that witness, then it turns out that her husband is alive and well. We're not going to paskin the din kifi pshutam shel dvarim. The Omer shekevin shenisei al pi oras Bezdin tipotem mikarbon. Since she relied on a horas Bezdin, therefore, like we saw in the case of parallel David Shel Tzibur, she doesn't have an obligation as a yachid to bring a carbon. Ella bikova dinis ahar. We're going to ask in the din that the original horas Bezdin was a tos, and therefore her marriage was based on the Eid Echad, not based on the horas Bezdin, because of Zeiri's logic that it's that the Eid Echad is like an expert witness. He's just clarifying the reality. And therefore, Tavi Chatas Shmein, she has to bring a Korban Chatas. Iyamri Pishlema did Tosu. Mishum Hachi Masya Korban. Iyamri Torah, my Masya Korban. Whenever a person violates the Torah based on a horah, then he passes the buck back to Bezdin. You decide whether you have to bring a korban. I don't have to bring a korban. I didn't give that horah. You gave me that horah. So you're concealed under the umbrella of horah, and therefore there's no chiyuv korban. That's what Rabbi Eliezer is saying here. When her husband turns out to be alive, she can't rely on any horah here. She can't say, well, I'm part of a korban because I was just implementing horah. You aren't implementing horah. Bezdin was basing themselves on a certain understanding of reality based on the testimony of one aid, and Bezdin made a toast. There's no horah here. You cannot clutch on and hold on to the umbrella of horah. There is no horah here. It's toast. And therefore you bring a korban. And the Gemara says, wait a minute, maybe we should reinterpret Rabbi Eliezer and reject this proof. The Dilma, perhaps, Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that what generates the chiyuv korban is Mishum the Kosar Rabbi Eliezer Yochid Shasam Oraz Bezdin Chayav. Okay, so this is another sugya in Masechet Horios, Taf Beis Amid Beis, Machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda holds that Yochid Shasam Oraz Bezdin Potu. As we said before, the Yachid hides behind the umbrella, the shield of Horas Bezdin. However, the Chachamim disagree, and they hold you chayev in such a case. If Bezdin is not chayev, it's not a part of Hel Dov Shel Tzibur, then the Mela, the Chiyuv Korban falls back on the individual. And that's what Rabbi Eliezer meant when he said, "B'imkein ma yikov hadinis hahar." In other words, if you want to understand the phrase of Rabbi Eliezer, what did he mean when he said Yikov Adinas Ahar? The answer is that if we look carefully into the din and we analyze it, we'll come to the conclusion that there's a chiyuv korban here. Meaning that you could have come to the conclusion that she's exempt from a korban based on the halach of Yachid Sha'asa Koras Bezdin. The Mishnah says, Haru Bezdin li Naseh, and then she was Makalkel. She has to bring a korban because they only allowed to get married in a legal sort of way, but not in a kilkel way. My kilkula. And here we have machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Eliezer, Omer, Zinsa. If she didn't get married legally, she was living out of wedlock with someone, and this woman is a pnuya. That's called kilkula. She has to bring a korban. Bezdin did not allow her any license to fool around, so to speak. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Almana lekohen gadol grusha v'chalutz lekohen hedja. We're talking about an illegitimate nesuin that was a violation of the din. That's called kilkula, and she has to bring a korban. Man the Omar zinsa kolshkein almana lekohen gadol. Aval man the Omar almana lekohen gadol zinsa lo. My timer the Omar atun hu dishavisin pnuya. According to the logic of Rabbi Eliezer, if zinsa is enough to be considered kilkula, how much more salmona lekohen gadol? But according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, almona lekohen gadol, that's clearly a kilkul. The Torah prohibits this. But zinsa, that's not kilkul. That's not. She's not chayv a korban my timer because asun tishavisin pnuya. What's asun hu tishavisin pnuya? It says atem asisim osi pnuya. I guess this is what she's saying to Bezdin. You made me into a pnuya. Why? Kevon shitartem osili nasa. You allowed me to get married. So you definitely subsumed me under the category of pnuya. But in the nesuin of almana lekohen gadol, you didn't make me into a pnuya. And therefore, you didn't give me a heter to marry a kohen gadol. But as far as getting married to someone else, I'm a pnuya because you told me I'm allowed to get married. Tanya Kavasi Rabbi Yochanan, Haru Bezdin li Naseh v'holcha v'kilchot kigon. You have to emphasize the word kigon. What's considered? What qualifies as holcha? The kilkula. That's almana lekohen gadol or grusha v'chalutza lekohen hedjod. And chayeves b'korban I'll call bia ubia. Oh, now we have another machlokes. And according to Rabbi Lazar, she has to bring a separate korban for each bia that she had. I mean, that's going to cost her a lot of money. And chachamim omrim korban echad al hakol. Why? Because she's violating the same isur twice. That's similar to eating a kazayas of chelev twice. And if you do them both behelim echas, then you only bring one korban. Umodim chacham Rabbi Lazar shem niseis lechamisha b'nei adam. If she got married to 5 different people until she finally found out that her husband's still alive, her first husband, shechayeves b'korban. that you don't have one carbon that covers all the bios, because these were bios from different men. Al kol echad v'echad, hol v'gufim mechulok. Right, in Chatos, we have halach of machalkin. So you could do many averas in helimachas, but if there's a machalik, then each avera generates its own independent chiyuv carbon. And here, what's the machalik? The fact that they're gufin mechulakim. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Tzadi Beis. Which means that you don't fall for yibum. And based on the testimony, presumably of two witnesses, it says Ubov Yomnu. He got married, Vinises, because her son survived her husband, and therefore she doesn't fall for yibum. It was just the opposite. Your son died first, and then your husband, and therefore you fell for yibum. Is Teitze Vavlad Richon Bi'achron Mams. All right, so some of this we can understand. Teitze, she's a Yevamot Shuk, and her marriage to someone from the Shuk is illegitimate, so she has to terminate that marriage, and now she needs either Yibum or Chalita from the Yavam. But what about the Vlad? So the language of the Mishnah is somewhat ambiguous. It says Rishon v'achron mamzer, which if you translate it literally, it means that the child from her first husband is a mamzer, but that can't be. So we have to reinterpret Rishon v'achron. And we'll see later on that Rishon v'achron means both the pregnancy from the second husband before she heard that her husband had died, or she got pregnant after she found out that her husband died. Now the Mishnah goes on. Which means that you fall for Yibum. And it's Yabma, and now she has a relationship with her brother-in-law. Was just the opposite, and therefore there was no yibum. And Shalom Malka Mitzvah is an erev of Eishasach, is Teitze. Vlad Richon v'achron mamzer. Obviously, she has to terminate her relationship with her brother-in-law. That's an erev, and there was no yibum here. And the Vlad that's born to both the first and the second is a mamzer. Again, what does it mean, both the first and the second? It means whether or not she got pregnant before she found out that she's not Omedes L'Yibum, she's a Kuka L'Yibum, or she found out after she got pregnant, after she found out. In both cases, the Vlad is a mamzer. Now the Mishnah goes on. Amrula meisbalech v'nises. In other words, she wasn't a candidate for Yibum, so she got married. That when you got married, he was alive. Umes, and he died subsequently. Teitze, we have to terminate the marriage between her and the person to whom she was married, and that's a knas. That's going to be a penalty, because she wasn't choker, she didn't do her due diligence at the time that she got, or before the time she married him, to find out for sure that her husband died. Havlad, harishon va'achron eno mamzer. I'm sorry. Havlad harishon mamzer va'achron eno mamzer. So that the child, when she became pregnant, thinking that her husband was dead, and it turns out that her husband is alive, that child is a mamzer. So what's ha'achron eno mamzer? because even though her husband was alive when she got married, nevertheless, he subsequently died. So if she had a bia with this second husband after the death of her husband, then the vlad is not a mamzer. Amrullah meis ba'alech. Again, there's no yibum here. But it's kacha. She got married to someone else, but only kedushin. She can go back and resume her marriage relationship with her husband. She doesn't need to get from the second husband. And all this is because she didn't do any avera and she doesn't subject herself, or she's not deserving of any knas. And therefore, we go back to the Torah law. The Torah law is that this kedushin is worthless to the second guy. It has no validity. Afal pishin nasan lo achron get lo psola min hakahuna. So now the kedushin to the sheni is not a valid kedushin, and therefore the get is not a get. Hence lo pasla min hakahuna. Which means that if she's an Ashes Cohen, she should resume her relationship with her husband, even though she got a get from the second guy. Or if she finally gets a get, or let's say he dies, she can marry another Cohen. Lo psola min hakahuna. Ezu darash Rabbi Eliezer ben Masya, ve'isha grusha me'isha lo yikachu, v'lo me'isha eno isha. So it's not a get that from someone who's not really married to her because she's an Ashes Ish and his kedushin is not valid. And that get does not disqualify her from a kohen. My rishon and my achron, ilema rishon lifnei shmua, the achron liachar shmua, the way we interpret it in the Mishnah. That means that when she got married in the shuk, because originally she was told that the vlad died first. Now we find out second. Right, now we find out. No, start again. Just got to get the sequence. Originally, we believed that the Vlad died first, that the Vlad died second. So she got married to Lashuk, and now we find out that Vlad died first. So she had a relationship with another man, and she was the Yevamot Lashuk. Is the child from that other man is a mamzer. However, we're going to differentiate between a case where she got pregnant before she knew the new news that her son died first and she was kukalivu. And achron means after the shmua. She found out that she's kukalivu, and she continued her relationship with her second husband, machdish ois, as we say, and she became pregnant. The Gemara asks, "Lisni havlad mamzer." I mean, you didn't have to mention Rishon and Achron. What was the point? And what difference does it make if it's before the Shmur or after the Shmur? The Vlad is a mamzer; she's a Yevamot Lashuk. And the Gemara answers, "Mishum de Kabbalah Misnei Sefer." This is what you call ID. That's to maintain the symmetry. Amru law in the Sefer it says, "Meis ba'alech v'niseis v'akach amru law kayam haya." That when you got married, your husband was still alive, umes, and subsequent to your marriage to the second husband, he died, her first husband. Is then a Rishon mamzer, achron eino mamzer. The Rishon who was born while her husband was still alive is a mamzer. The achron who was born after her husband's death is not a mamzer. So since we had to differentiate between the Rishon and the Achron, therefore in the Sefer, therefore Tananami Rachel Rishon v'Achron. It's just a matter of finding a barrel. Torah Rabbanon, Zo Divrei Rabbi Akiva. This Mishnah that says that the Vlad of a Yevamot who got married without chalitza from her first husband, from the brother of her first husband, and the Vlad is a mamzer because of the violation of Yevamot Lashuk, that has to be Rabbi Akiva, Shahaya Omer Ein Kiddushin Tosa B'Chayvei Lav. And therefore the Vlad of Chayvei Lav is a mamzer. Avol Chachamim Omer Ein Mamzer B'Yevamot Lashuk. Yevamot Lashuk is at worst case an Iser Lav, and therefore it doesn't generate mamzerus when she married someone else. So Gemara asks for Lema Ein Mamzer Michayvei Lavnim. Why does it say Ein Mamzer Mi Yevamot? Yevamot is just a simple case in, an example of one case, but you should have given me the klal that Ein Mamzer Michayvei Lavnim. And Gemara answers, Hai Tana. This Tana has a different version of his Rabbi Akiva. Hach Tana de Rabbi Akiva. So we're talking about a Tana who comes out of the base medrash of Rabbi Akiva. The Omar, and he makes a fundamental distinction between two categories of Chayvei Lav. There's Chayvei Lavim to She'er and Chayvei Lavim graded. So what's a case of Chayvei Lavim to She'er? That the Lav is violated because of a Kiruv Mishpacha. That's very rare. Kiruv Mishpacha always generates what we call Chayvei Krisus, if not Chayvei Misus Bezdin. How could you have an Iser Bia Machmas Kurva, Machmas Mishpacha, and yet it only generates a Lav, a Malchus? And the answer is Anusas Aviv. So you have a father and a son. The father raped a woman, and the son now is not allowed to have a relationship with that woman, and that's called Chayvei Lav. And then the balance of the Isurim, which like Yevamot Lashuk, which is not what we call Kiruv Mishpacha, even Rabbi Akiva would agree that as far as those lavim are concerned, it doesn't generate mamzeros. Okay, and this takes us to Omer Rabbi Yehuda on the bottom of Tzadi Bey's Amud Aleph.